Voice from the Dust, a Shoshone perspective on the Bear River Massacre, an article by Darren Perry. Darren Perry is the chairman of the Northwest Band Tribal Council of the Shoshone Nation. On November 8, 2018, at Brigham Young University, he presented this talk for the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies. He is working to create the Boa Agoi Cultural Interpretive Center, an educational center that will share the story of the Bear River Massacre. On January 29, 1863, the U.S. Army attacked the Shoshone encamped at the Bear River, near present-day Preston, Idaho, and slaughtered 250 to 500 Shoshone people, including women and children. Public reports of this massacre were officially given by the U.S. Army and by Latter-day Saint settlers, but the Shoshone survivors also kept a history. Perry shares that history here.
Not long after the final shot was heard, echoing in the Preston Valley, and the final breath of the dying was taken, the work of remembering began. When the U.S. Army, under the command of Colonel Patrick E. Connor and his California volunteers from Camp Douglas, Utah, massacred a peaceful band of Shoshone Indians on that cold winter morning, they controlled for a time what was to be remembered, but not anymore. Have you ever had a memory sneak out of your eye and roll down your cheek? I have that all the time when I think about the massacre at Boa Agoi. For thousands of years, our tribal elders would sit down with our young children and tell them stories. These stories were always the same. There was never a word out of place. It had to be that way. It had to be accurate. Our children needed to hear those stories as their elders had heard those stories from their fathers. Because as you know, in our culture, nothing is ever written down. I want you to know that I went through this same process with my grandmother. Her name was May Timbimbu Perry. She was the most gentle woman that I'd ever known. She had black hair with deep creases in her skin that told of a life of a loving, nurturing tribal elder who loved her people. She would sit for hours and she'd tell me stories about how the coyotes stole fire or how the sun got its name. And then with reverence in her tone and sometimes a tear in her eye, she would relate the story of the massacre at Bear River. There's an old Indian saying that says, when an old Indian dies, a library burns. And that is never as true as it was about my grandmother, May. As I grew older and attended school, I developed a great love for history because of her. And then one day I suddenly realized something. None of the stories that my grandmother told me are in our history books. But how could that be? I had always believed that historical events were an absolute. Events that transpired over time had only one conclusion. But as I've gotten older, I've come to realize that history is always about perspective. Whose perspective? And then one day I was lucky enough to read a quote attributed to Winston Churchill, the great English leader, who said that history is always written by the victors. That perfectly explains why Native American histories aren't in our history books today, but they need to be. Our Chief Sagwitch, and his band lived like their forefathers had lived for hundreds of years. We were hunters and gatherers. We traveled with the changing seasons. He was born in 1822 in Bear River City, which means he never really knew a time in his life without the presence of the white man. The Shoshone referred to themselves as Sosogoi, which means people who travel on foot. They looked upon the earth as not just a place to live, but something so sacred and special that they called her mother. She was the provider of our livelihoods. You see, to my native people, mountains and streams and plains stand forever, and the seasons walk around annually. We traveled to different areas of this country when the game was plentiful and the seeds and berries were abundant. If you can imagine, it was probably a hard way of life, never more than a few days away from starvation. But it was a happy life. Every member of the tribe played an important role in its survival. But all of that was about to change. In the summer of 1847, Sagwitch received word that there were a group of white settlers making their way through Wyoming and heading towards the Salt Lake Valley. And on July 31st, Sagwitch and 10 other men traveled to Salt Lake City and had the opportunity to meet the first group of pioneers. Now, he didn't get to meet with Brigham Young that day because of his illness. He instead met with a man that we're all familiar with named Heber C. Kimball. Heber C. Kimball, at the conclusion of that meeting, said, quote, "The lands belong to the Lord, and we calculate to plow and plant it. No man shall have the power to sell his inheritance, for he cannot remove it. It belongs to the Lord." End of quote. As you can imagine, within months, disputes arose among my people and the Mormon settlers over the payment of rent. Chief Sagwitch's life now was about to get complicated. For years and years, his only thoughts were, how am I going to best take care of my growing family and take care of my small band? Now things were different. Over the next few years, as more and more saints arrived, good land was now becoming harder to come by. In 1856, the church sent Peter Mon and other saints to settle the Cache Valley for good. That one act would have a devastating effect on our people. Not long after, other saints would soon arrive to that beautiful valley. I want you to know that in those early days, the saints referred to our people as the friendly ones. As more and more people arrived and land was coming scarce, they began to describe us as thieves and beggars, which was probably true from their perspective. The irony, though, in that for me, is that the Mormon people themselves had suffered so much hate and injustice with their trek across this country. It's hard for me to believe that they could be found guilty of doing the same thing. Peter Mon, who is now the area authority in Cache Valley, said this: "With extraordinarily good luck, the California volunteers will completely wipe them out. We wish this community rid of all such parties. And if Colonel Connor can be successful in reaching that bastard class of citizens who play with the lives of the peaceful and the law-abiding citizens in this way, we shall be pleased to acknowledge our obligations." With this development and the use of the California and Oregon trails that cut through the heart of Shoshone land, I felt like our people had three options: beg for food, starve, or steal. And I'm sure they did all three. We now have two different groups of people living two different lives and two different lifestyles. In early January of 1863, the Mormon settlers and those using the California and Oregon trails started making requests to Salt Lake City with letters to put an end to the Indian depredations. Arrest warrants were issued in Salt Lake City by a federal judge for the arrests of Chief Pocatello, Bear Hunter, and Sagwitch. Colonel Connor and his men were mustered into service. A Mormon scout named Porter Rockwell served as their guide. He led Colonel Connor and his men just north of Logan, Utah, where Battle Creek meets BYU, or what the white settlers called the Bear River. On the night of January 27th in 1863, an old tribal elder, a medicine man by the name of Tindup, had a dream, and he foresaw the calamity which was about to take place. In his dream, he saw his people being killed by pony soldiers. He woke up from his dream and hurriedly woke everyone up and told everyone of his dream and urged everyone to leave that night with him and his family. There were some families that believed the dream of Tindup and left with him, and their lives were spared. In the meantime, just the day before, a white friend from Franklin, a grocery store owner who was friends with Sagwitch and his band, had come to the camp and told him that the settlers from Cache Valley had made plans to get rid of the northwestern band of Shoshones, and that they'd sent appeals to the army that was stationed in Salt Lake City to come and take care of the Indian problem once and for all. Sagwitch, being an early riser, got up as usual on the morning of the 29th. He left his teepee and he stood outside and surveyed the area around his camp. He noticed something different. The hills to the southeast appeared to be covered in a steaming mist. The mist seemed to creep lower on the bluff. And then suddenly he realized something. It was the horse's breath from the troops that had just arrived. The soldiers from Camp Douglas were now on his doorstep. The chief wasn't surprised. He called to his sleeping village. They quickly gathered their bows and arrows and tomahawks and sticks and rocks and anything they could find to fight with. A few of the men had rifles, but very few bullets. Some of the Indians were so excited that they gathered whatever was in sight to use them as a weapon or as a shield. My grandmother told me that some of the women were picking up their woven willow baskets to use those as shields. Chief Sagwitch now shouted to his people to refrain from firing first. He thought that perhaps this military man was a just and a wise man, that he could negotiate a peaceful settlement to this conflict. But that wasn't the case. Many of the Indians ran towards the river and dropped into the snow. They knew that they weren't guilty of anything, but they would fight if they had no choice. Some of them even dropped into the clay foxholes that the children had dug along the Bear River during the summer months. I'm sure never did those grown men realize that one day they would use those clay foxholes to await a real military conflict. Colonel Connor and his men began to fire upon my people. But what was an arrow compared to the sidearms and rifle of the army? The Indians were now being slaughtered like rabbits. Indian men, women, and children were being slaughtered left and right. No butcher could have done any better. Most of the action took place among the willows and along the river. The massacre started early in the morning, according to my people, and lasted for what seemed like hours. The Bear River, which was slightly frozen earlier, was now starting to flow. The Shoshone people were jumping into the river to try to escape by swimming across. The blazing white snow, if you can imagine, is now brilliant red with blood. The willows that were being used as hiding places were now bent down as if in defeat. The old dry leaves that had been clinging to those willows were now flying through the air like whizzing bullets. Many of the Indian women began jumping into the river, most of them with their babies and young children. Most all of them died. There was one woman in particular named Angie Chi. She was being chased by the soldiers. She jumped into the river and hid under an overhanging bank. By doing this, her life was saved. She watched the massacre from her hiding place, at the same time trying to treat the 7 bullet wounds that she had to her chest and arm. Angie Chi carried those scars for the rest of her life. She would often show them to the young Shoshone children at Washakie as she told about the massacre of her people. She also related how she'd lost her own baby to the river that day. The Indians that were now still alive began calling to their chief to escape with them. Chief Sagwitch did escape by riding a horse across the river. Another Indian escaped by holding onto the tail of the horse that Sagwitch took. The cruelest killing of all was that of Chief Bear Hunter. Perhaps it was the cruelest death in the white Indian struggle. Knowing that he was one of the chiefs, the soldiers shot him, kicked him, whipped him, tortured him, and tried several other means to make him die. But the old chief, not only wouldn't he die, he wouldn't carry on or make a sound, as crying and carrying on was a sign of being a coward. Because he would not die or cry out, the military man became frustrated and angry. One of them took their bayonet and stepped to a burning campfire and heated the bayonet until it was glowing red. He then ran the hot, burning metal through the chief's head from ear to ear. Chief Bear Hunter went to his grave a man of honor. He left behind a wife and many children. The Indian camp was now vanishing right before Sagwitch's eyes. Later that afternoon, as the field of massacre was silent, except for the cries of the wounded soldiers being carried away, the Shoshone people who had escaped watched as the wagons left the camp. As they drove off, the wagon wheels made a very mournful sound as they squeaked across the snow. By nightfall, the Indians who had escaped were cold and wet and hungry. There was no food to be found, for the soldiers had done a good job of scattering the food and setting fire to everything. All of the teepees were burnt to the ground except one. That one lone teepee looked as if it was made of net. That teepee was that of Chief Sagwitch and his family. After the soldiers left, Sagwitch made his way to his teepee. He opened his flap and saw his life laying there dead. Beside her was an infant daughter who was still alive. Sagwitch ordered those that were with him to take that little girl and put her in a cradle board and hang her in a nearby tree. He knew that without nourishment from its mother, it would die anyway. And his hope was that a kind-hearted settler's family from Franklin, Idaho, would find that girl and raise her to adulthood. That young girl was picked up the next morning, and she was raised to adulthood, and her name is Jane Hull. And she's now buried in the Hooper City Cemetery in Weber County. The surviving Indians couldn't believe what had just taken place. I'm sure Sagwitch was a very stunned and shocked man, sickened and grief at heart. He stood idly and mournfully gazed at the scene. He was remembering that just days before, the place had been a happy place. He remembered the many seasons that the Shoshone had wintered in and around Battle Creek, where there were so many warm, hot springs. At this time, the chief probably realized that he was living in two different worlds. One group was greedy and wanted everything. The other group only wanted to live and travel as they'd done for hundreds and hundreds of years. One group made their wishes and dreams come true by making themselves the conqueror at the expense of a defenseless people who only wanted to be left alone. As news of the massacre reached those living in Logan and Wellsville, some of the feelings of the local saints began to come out. Mary Ann Weston Mon, wife of Peter Mon, wrote that the residents of Cache Valley regarded Connor's efforts as an imposition of providence in their behalf, and commented that the Indians had caused so much trouble that patience had ceased to be a virtue. Henry Ballard, bishop of the Logan First Ward, said, "This put a quietus upon the Indians. The Lord raised up his foe in Colonel Connor to punish them without us having to do it. We had bore a great deal from them from time to time and still had been feeding them. Yet some of the wicked spirits among them would stir up trouble against us." George Farrell, secretary of the Logan Second Ward, recorded in the official minutes that we, the people of Cache Valley, looked upon the movement of Colonel Connor as an intervention of the Almighty, as the Indians had been a great source of great annoyance to us for a long time. And finally, Bishop Peter Mon, the area authority in Cache Valley, in a letter to Brigham Young dated February 4th, soberly tabulated the number of Indians killed, added, "I feel my skirts rid of their blood. They rejected the way of life and salvation, which was pointed out from them from time to time, and thus have perished relying upon their own strength and wisdom. It may seem naive to expect the saints who lived in the outer reaches of the country now to adhere to the same policy that Brigham Young had always preached, where he said, it is easier to feed the Indians than to fight them. So how did the people of Cache Valley come to terms with this tragic event? And how did they remember it? And how did they start telling the story? Just north of Preston, Idaho today, there's an old monument just off of Highway 91 that sits really close to the massacre. The monument was erected in 1932 by the people of Franklin County. It was meant to tell the history or the story of what happened that fateful day. This was a celebrated event. The whole community came together to tell their history and stories. But I want you to know something. What the monument really accomplished was that it gives people a reason to forget. A monument strips us of our obligation to find out for ourselves what actually took place. And a monument tells us how it wants the past to be remembered. Humans have great memories for what they want to remember. In commemorating the battle, you forget the uglier parts, and you only focus on the heroism of the soldier and saint. That is the kind of Daughters of Utah Pioneers plaque that exists there today. And that narrative now becomes the story. It's not a story anymore about my people. It becomes a story about the brave soldiers and the saints who took care of them. In constructing the monument, you firm up memory and you create new history. The plaque reads, attacks by the Indians on the peaceful inhabitants in this vicinity led to the final battle here on January 29th in 1863. The conflict occurred in deep snow and bitter cold. Scores of wounded soldiers were taken to the battle from the battlefield to the Latter-day Saint community of Franklin, Idaho. Here, pioneer women, trained through trials and necessities of frontier living, accepted the responsibility of caring for the wounded until they could be removed to Camp Douglas, Utah. 2 Indian women and their children who were found alive after the encounter were given homes in Franklin. So is that really what happened? The problem with that narrative for me is that it only gives us one point of view or one generation's perspective, 69 years after the actual event. It's like a view from a window that has been carefully placed to exclude a whole quadrant of a beautiful landscape. You only get to see what they want you to see. The plaque also reinforces the view that Indians were savages, and even went so far as to label our women and children as enemy combatants. It reinforces the view that violence on the frontier was a necessity for the survival of Mormon communities, and showed what the consequences would be when both groups tried to share the same space. What if the plaque, though, had been written from the Northwestern Band's perspective? Would it have said the same? Maybe it would say this: the massacre of the Northwestern Band of Shoshone Nation occurred in this vicinity on January 29th in 1863. Colonel Patrick E. Connor and his command of California volunteers from Camp Douglas, Utah, attacked a sleeping Indian village in the early morning hours of the day. The soldiers shot, raped, bludgeoned, and bayoneted several hundred men, women, and children to their death. The Indians fought back with the limited weapons available to them, but the band was all but annihilated. So which version of the massacre is correct? I suppose the answer lies in your perspective. The events that took place on that January morning have long been forgotten by most. Maybe guilt or remorse has silenced all those who one day may have wanted to know the truth. It's my hope that a new generation will have a desire to listen and learn, not because we're looking to have things made right, but I believe that those who sacrifice their life have a God-given right to be heard. Their voice speaks to me and you from the dust. My grandmother would tell me, if you're there at just the right time in the evening, you can sit and you can hear the cries of the little ones crying for their mothers. Your senses tell you that you're among the spirits of more than 400 children of Dhamma Appa, or the Great Spirit who created us all. You don't have to see things as they were to know that a terrible injustice had taken place. You can feel it. Someone once said, if my pen might have the gift of tears, I would write a book, and I would call it The Indian, and I would make the whole world weep. Only the most brazen soul could fail to weep when contemplating the fall of this people. For the next 10 years, Sagwitch and those who had survived continued to scratch out a meager existence. Their way of life had been drastically altered by the coming of the Mormon pioneers. But all of that changed in the winter of 1873. Native American leaders in Sagwitch began having dreams and other spiritual manifestations. One night, Sagwitch was visited in a dream by 3 men who told him the existence of a God among the Mormon people, and that this God was a true God, and that he needed to send someone to Salt Lake that would tell them what to do. The next day, Sagwitch didn't do that. He knew of a man that lived in Ogden, Utah. So the next day, that Sagwitch traveled to Ogden to meet with this well-known Indian missionary named George Washington Hill. Hill had served a mission to the Lemhi Shoshones in central Idaho some 17 years earlier and was skilled with the language. Brother Hill told Sagwitch that there is order in my church and that I am no longer called to be a missionary and I can't help you. This exchange took place over the next 2 days as well. A week later, George Washington Hill was summoned to the office of Brigham Young. And as he walked in his office, he was told by the prophet that I have a great burden upon my shoulders. And Brother Hill, that great burden is now going to become yours. The prophet then called him to be a missionary to my Shoshone people. As he arrived home that evening, guess who was sitting on the front porch? Sagwitch. He told the old chief now that he was now called to be a missionary again, and that he had the power given to him by a prophet of God, and that he would now come teach them the gospel of Jesus Christ. He told Sagwitch that he had a job, he had a family, he had a ranch, and that it would take him a little bit of time to put his affairs in order. Little did he know, and Sagwitch know, that that time would come sooner rather than later. Just 1 week after Brigham Young called Brother Hill to be a missionary, he went to work in Ogden as a night watchman for the Union Pacific. He reported to work as usual, and his job was to guard the cargo on the train as it came in from Evanston that night. Upon arriving to work, though, that night, he was informed that there had been a train derailment in Evanston and that there would be no train coming to Ogden. He thought for a moment, and then he jumped on a freighter that was making their way towards Corinne, Utah. When he arrived in Corinne, he waited until it was light. He asked the locals where the Indian encampment was, and he set out on foot. Just outside of town, to his surprise, he passed a young Shoshone boy on a horse who told him that he was going to town to get some food for a big celebration. As George continued further on down the road, he passed a second brave who told him the same thing. After journeying about another 10 miles, he saw a man in the distance on a horse who was leading another horse. As he got closer, he could tell it was his old friend, Chief Sagwitch. As they met, Sagwitch told him that he was coming to get his friend, for he surely must have been tired. George must have looked at him puzzled and told Sagwitch that he did not tell anyone he was coming. It was then that Chief Sagwitch said, I had a dream last night, and the Great Spirit told me you were coming today. You see, the Great Spirit has always spoken to my people in dreams from the time of Father Lehi and Nephi to the present day. After Brother Hill after what he described as the best breakfast a man could ever have in his journal, he commenced with teaching them the gospel and the creation and the stories of the prophets, and even went down to the modern day and how the Lord had raised up a prophet in these latter days. The very next day, George Washington Hill baptized 102 Shoshones near Honeyville, Utah, in the Bear River, if you can imagine. The same Bear River where Sagwitch had almost watched the entire destruction of his people. Our conversion into the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is now the story. It serves as a backdrop of who we are today as a tribe and why our tribal story is a little different than other tribes. Accepting an organized religion taught us principles of success and hard work. We were taught to farm. We were taught to work hard, pay our taxes, and contribute to society. I believe it made us better equipped to handle a changing world. Assimilation, which is normally a bad word in Native American country, kept us off government-sponsored reservations, where alcoholism and unemployment and drug abuse and suicide sometimes run 4 to 5 times the national average. We have 559 members of our tribe today. Our tribal office is located in Brigham City, Utah. We provide our members with housing options for our elderly, health care for those who can't afford it, and education for our children. The vast majority of us live along the Wasatch Front. We are probably your neighbors. We are active participants in your communities. We have 28 of our children attending universities around this country today. We as a tribe realized long ago that education is the key to our future, as it is yours. Our younger generations are now coming back to serve our people. Our CFO, for example, got his bachelor's and master's degree and then worked at PricewaterhouseCoopers in Boston for 6 years before returning home to serve our people. We have 3 tribally owned businesses who help us help our people. They also help us to raise money and acquire more of the land at the Massacre site, which will one day allow us to build an interpretive center there so that we can protect those memories of those who have gone before. There's an old saying that many of you have heard that says, give a man a fish and you feed him for a day. Teach a man a fish and you feed him for a lifetime. Sagwitch realized a long time ago and made the decision a long time ago to teach his people to fish. Being a Native American to my people isn't an entitlement program. We have chosen a different path. We have chosen as a tribal nation to control our own destiny and create our own history. But we remember and we honor the past because it allows us to succeed in the future. Someone once said, never let your past experiences harm your future. Your past cannot be altered, and your future doesn't deserve the punishment. We are grateful. I am grateful. The past negative experiences didn't alter Sagwitch's future because it would have altered mine. The most successful Native Americans today are those who can best balance culture and change. We honor our culture. We honor our heritage. We honor those who have gone before. They are vitally important to us. We honor them and their traditions, but we realize that we live in an ever-changing world, and we are preparing ourselves to change and succeed with it. The massacre at BYU has taught me many lessons over the years. For one, it's taught me that bad things happen to people, to you and I. But how we respond to those bad things will determine our character and who we are going to become. It has taught me to offer unconditional forgiveness, but it doesn't mean you need to forget. It has taught me that ordinary people can affect real change. My grandmother refused to accept the narrative on that plaque erected by well-meaning people in 1932. And now, as a result, we have a voice. It's also taught me that everyone has a story worthy of being told. What is your story? It's equally as important as mine. It has taught me that as we preserve history, that all views need to be represented and respected. The Shoshone narrative that we have today came from my grandmother, which originated from Chief Sagwitch and his family's accounts. I am sensitive to the fact that that does not represent the families of Bear Hunter, Soquitch, Chief Pocatello, and others. Their stories are equally as important. And I'm sorry that those stories may have been lost to us forever. It has also taught me that the souls of my ancestors peer out from behind my mask of skin, and that through my memories, they get to live again. I hope we never forget where we came from. May I close with the words from historian David Lewis, emeritus professor at Utah State University. He said this: ultimately, the story of Bear River is their story. And in some way, we need to respect the story that they want to have told, as well as recognize our role in that story. History doesn't always affirm us. Sometimes history challenges us to think about an uglier past that we'd rather not have. And that's really the power and the benefit of history. It connects us to the past. It connects us to our humanity and our inhumanity. And it offers us a way forward, especially in a circumstance like this, with the Shoshone together, moving forward in a story that connects us, not in the prettiest of ways, but to move forward to a new relationship that's a 21st century relationship based on respect. Respect for the truth and respect for what happened in that past moment. That is where you get the possibility for reconciliation. I want to thank the Red Center for having me today and for giving my people a voice and allowing me to tell the story.
About the author. Darren Perry is the chairman of the Northwest Band Tribal Council at the Shoshone Nation. He serves on the board of directors for the American West Heritage Center in Wellsville, Utah, the Utah State Museum Board, and the advisory board of the Huntsman Cancer Institute. In 2017, he received an Esto Perpetua Award for preservation and promotion of history in Idaho. He attended the University of Utah and Weber State College and received a bachelor's degree in secondary education with an emphasis in history. This is an audio production of BYU Studies, read for you by Joseph Sandholtz and Darren Perry. BYU Studies publishes scholarship informed by the restored gospel of Jesus Christ. For more information and access to articles, essays, and more, visit byustudies.byu.edu.